Welcome back to The Innovative Teacher. In our last episode, we explored what it really means to move innovation beyond individual classrooms and into a shared whole-school approach. We talked about alignment, leadership, and why meaningful change in education never comes from devices alone. It comes from clarity, purpose, and shared understanding. Today we're continuing that conversation with an episode titled Not All VR is Created Equal. And this is an important one, because it addresses one of the most common misunderstandings we see across schools, universities, and training organizations. Over the years, I've worked with many institutions that proudly tell me, "We have VR." And almost every time my first question is the same. What are students actually doing inside the experience to support learning? And how do you know learning is taking place? There's usually a pause. Not because educators don't care about learning. Quite the opposite. It's because that question often hasn't been built into the implementation process. Schools will describe their headsets, their software library, or the different environments students can explore. They'll talk about engagement, excitement, curiosity, and all of those things are real. You can see them instantly when a student puts on a headset for the first time. But engagement and learning are not the same thing. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in immersive education. Simply owning VR hardware does not mean immersive learning is happening. In many cases, institutions don't actually have an educational solution yet. They have a collection of devices. And those devices are often deployed without a pedagogical framework, without assessment alignment, and without a professional learning model that helps teachers translate potential into practice. When that happens, VR becomes impressive to watch but difficult to justify. It becomes a demonstration rather than a learning medium. And that's not a technology failure. It's a design gap, because hardware is not a learning strategy. When a school says it has VR, what they almost always mean is that they have headsets. Access to devices is necessary, of course. You can't run immersive experiences without them. But devices are only the entry point. They are infrastructure, not pedagogy. Without intentional integration into teaching and learning, VR risks becoming something many schools have seen before. A piece of technology that arrives with excitement, gets used enthusiastically for a short period of time, and then gradually becomes underutilized. Not because it lacks value but because it lacks structure. In classrooms where this happens, VR often appears as a short activity. Students take turns wearing a headset. They explore a virtual environment for a few minutes. They look around, react, point things out, maybe call their friends over to see something interesting. Then they return to their desks and continue the lesson. The excitement is real. The memory is real. But what students actually learned, and how that learning can be demonstrated, is often unclear. It's important to pause here and say something clearly. This is not a failure of teachers. It's a failure of systems. When schools invest in hardware without making the same investment in curriculum alignment, learning design, and professional development, they unintentionally place teachers in an impossible position. Teachers are expected to innovate without structure, evaluate learning without evidence, and justify impact without tools. Over time, even the most enthusiastic educators begin to step back from using the technology, not because they don't believe in it, but because they don't have the support needed to use it well. I once worked with a secondary school that had purchased a full class set of VR headsets through a special innovation grant. Leadership encouraged staff to try them across different subjects. In the first term, students explored virtual museums, famous landmarks, and immersive environments connected to their topics. Engagement was high. Students talked about the experiences. Teachers saw curiosity and interest. But by the second year, the headsets were rarely used. When we spoke with staff, their feedback was consistent. They didn't know how to link the experiences to assessment. They weren't sure how to measure learning outcomes. They couldn't clearly explain the academic value to parents or leadership. The problem wasn't motivation or willingness. It was the absence of shared expectations, learning design, and institutional structure. Without those elements, even powerful tools drift to the margins. Another common scenario appears when VR is used primarily for observation. Students enter a 360-degree environment. perhaps a historical reconstruction, a natural landscape, or a virtual tour. They can look around in every direction. The visuals are impressive. The experience feels immersive. But they're still observers. They're not acting. They're not deciding. They're not testing ideas. From a learning perspective, many of these experiences function much like high-quality videos displayed through a headset. Immersion can increase curiosity and emotional engagement, which is valuable, but immersion alone does not guarantee understanding. Decades of research in learning science tell us something very consistent. Understanding deepens when learners actively engage. When they manipulate variables, test ideas, make decisions, and reflect on outcomes, their thinking changes. Their understanding becomes more flexible, more transferable, and more durable. The difference is not the headset. The difference is the learning design. I saw this clearly in a primary geography unit where students explored a virtual rainforest environment. In the first year, the experience focused on observation. Students looked around, noticed animals, commented on scenery, and described what they saw. They enjoyed it and they remembered details. But when asked to explain ecological relationships or human impact, many struggled. They could describe what was there but not how it worked. The following year, the same unit used an interactive environment. This time, students identified species, traced food chains, and made land use decisions that produced visible consequences. They saw what happened when balance changed. They discussed cause and effect. They reflected on outcomes. Their explanations became more detailed. Their vocabulary improved. Their assessment responses showed deeper conceptual understanding. The environment hadn't changed. The design had. One of the most persistent myths about VR is the belief that experience automatically produces comprehension. It's easy to see why people assume that. If a student can walk through a virtual heart, stand on the surface of Mars, or observe a chemical reaction up close, it feels like learning must be happening. But experience alone is not enough. Students can explore extraordinary environments and still miss the underlying concepts. Learning occurs when experience is paired with intention, scaffolding, and reflection. Without those elements, experiences remain impressions rather than understanding. High-quality educational VR builds learning into the experience itself. It includes decision points, challenges, prompts, and feedback. It makes thinking visible. It gives teachers opportunities to intervene, question, extend, and support. I once observed a senior science class exploring a virtual circulatory system. In the first version of the lesson, students navigated freely. They enjoyed it, but assessment results showed minimal improvement in understanding. The experience was then redesigned so that students traced blood flow, responded to simulated system failures, explained pressure changes, and answered reflection questions embedded within the environment. The difference in understanding was significant, especially for students who had previously struggled with abstract diagrams. The key change wasn't the technology, it was the structure around it. This brings us to another important point. Commercial VR content is not the same as educational design. Commercial experiences can absolutely play a role in classrooms. They can provide access to environments that would otherwise be impossible to visit. They can spark curiosity and build background knowledge. But most commercially available content is not created with curriculum outcomes, assessment requirements, or classroom constraints in mind. Educational VR begins somewhere else entirely. It begins with questions. What should students understand after this experience? What actions will demonstrate that understanding? How will learning be observed or assessed? How does this connect to teaching before and after the experience? When those questions guide implementation, VR becomes part of a learning sequence rather than an isolated event. Without them, it risks becoming a novelty. And when schools begin describing themselves as innovative simply because they own headsets, something more serious can happen. Over time, that message can unintentionally undermine trust in immersive learning. Teachers may become skeptical because they don't see impact. Leaders may become cautious because they can't measure results. VR becomes associated with hype rather than substance. In those situations, teachers are often blamed when VR doesn't work, even though they were never given the time, tools, or framework to make it work. that erodes confidence, limits future innovation, and reduces opportunities for students. For immersive learning to support real understanding, students need to act. They need to experiment, make decisions, experience consequences, and reflect. That principle holds true across subjects. In science, it might mean manipulating variables. In history, it might mean exploring perspectives. In vocational learning, it might mean practicing procedures safely. In mathematics, it might mean interacting with abstract concepts in spatial ways. Action transforms VR from a viewing platform into a learning environment. A simple way for schools to evaluate the quality of an immersive lesson is to ask a few reflective questions. Are students making decisions? Is learning visible? Is there clear curriculum alignment? Is the teacher actively facilitating? Is reflection structured? If the answer to those questions is no, the experience may still be immersive. But it is not yet educational. And that distinction is the heart of today's conversation. Not all VR is created equal. The difference doesn't lie in the brand of headset or the sophistication of graphics. It lies in intention, design, and systems. Technology doesn't determine educational value. Learning design does. VR does not fail education. Education fails VR when it mistakes devices for design. But when schools understand that difference, when they align pedagogy, structure, and purpose, immersive learning begins to deliver on its promise. It stops being something impressive to watch and becomes something powerful to learn through. And that's where real transformation begins. In our next episode, we'll continue this journey by exploring how educators can align technology, pedagogy, and purpose to ensure immersive learning experiences are meaningful, intentional, and truly support student understanding. Until then, keep observing, keep reflecting, and keep thinking like an innovative teacher. Thanks for listening.